By April 1941, one fact seemed beyond dispute. Greece was finished. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Germany had invaded with 12 divisions and the full weight of the Luftwaffe. Yugoslavia had collapsed in 11 days. The British forces that had come to help Greece were retreating to the coast. Athens was about to fall. The swastika would fly over the Acropolis within days. And Italy, the country that had invaded Greece 6 months earlier and been humiliated in the mountains of Epirus, and Albania, the country whose best Alpine divisions had been stopped and pushed back and mocked by an army that wasn't supposed to be able to fight. Italy was finally on the winning side. The Greeks had stopped them. For 5 months, in the snow and the mud of the Albanian mountains, Greek infantry had done something that no other army in Europe had managed. They had pushed back. They had advanced. They had taken Italian territory and held it and made Mussolini fire, general after general, in desperation. First, Sebastiano Visconti Prasca, the architect of the invasion, the man who personally promised Mussolini that 2 weeks was sufficient. Relieved of command in November 1940, after the Greek counter-offensive began tearing his plans apart. Then Pietro Badoglio, Italy's most senior military figure, the Chief of General Staff, a man whose reputation stretched back to the First World War, forced out in December 1940 after the scale of the Albanian disaster became impossible to disguise. Then Ubaldo Soddu, who arrived to replace Badoglio, assessed the situation and lasted barely a month before his private correspondence to Rome became so despairing that Mussolini had no choice but to remove him too. 3 generals, 3 months, one small country that was not supposed to be able to fight. Finally, General Ugo Cavallero took command. His first act was to request German assistance. His diary from January 1941 describes the Albanian front as a hemorrhage of steel. Italian equipment abandoned in the mountain passes, captured by Greek soldiers who drove it back toward the Italian lines with Greek flags painted on the hulls. But now, Hitler had provided the help Mussolini needed. The combined weight of German and Italian forces was more than Greece could absorb. The country was falling. And the Italian commanders, who had spent a humiliating winter watching their army fail against an opponent they had dismissed as irrelevant, allowed themselves, for the first time in months, to feel something approaching satisfaction. Greece was finished. The Greek military was destroyed. The Greek Air Force had been ground down to almost nothing, first fighting Italy, then fighting Germany. Whatever pilots had survived were either dead, captured, or fleeing south toward Egypt with whatever aircraft they could still fly. What the Italian commanders did not know, what their intelligence had not told them because the idea itself seemed too improbable to contemplate, was that those Greek pilots were already in Egypt, already in cockpits, and already thinking about the next time they would be in the same sky as Italian aircraft. To understand why Italian pilots were terrified, you first have to understand what those Greek pilots had already done before they ever reached Africa. The Hellenic Air Force that went to war in October 1940 was not a modern air force by the standards of the major powers. Limited resources, limited aircraft, a training pipeline that reflected the financial constraints of a small nation rearming without adequate budget. What it had was pilots, men selected for aviation because they were exceptional, trained with the intensity of a military that knew it was outnumbered and understood that individual skill would have to compensate for numerical inferiority. Among them was Marinos Mitralexis, a name that needs no introduction if you've been following this channel. If you haven't seen the dedicated video we made about him, It's on this channel and the first link in the description, and it will change how you understand everything that follows. Mitralexis had the kind of flying instincts that instructors notice immediately, the ability to understand three-dimensional space in combat, the aggression in an engagement that separates pilots who survive from pilots who dominate. On November 2nd, 1940, just days into the war with Italy, Mitralexis was flying over the Epirus front when he encountered an Italian Cant Z.1007 bomber. He attacked. He fired until his ammunition was exhausted. The Italian bomber was still flying. What Mitralexis did next has been documented in Greek military records and confirmed by multiple sources. He flew his PZL alongside the Italian bomber. He brought his propeller into contact with the Italian aircraft's tail. He damaged it sufficiently that the bomber could no longer maintain controlled flight. Then he landed his own damaged aircraft, got out, and personally helped capture the Italian crew when they came down nearby. He rammed an Italian bomber with his propeller and captured the crew. When this story circulated through the Italian Air Force, and it did circulate because stories like this always circulate, it produced a specific reaction among Italian aviators, not disbelief. They believed it. They had been fighting Greeks for weeks by then, and they knew that disbelief was no longer a rational response to what Greek pilots were capable of. What they felt was something closer to unease, because a pilot who will ram your aircraft when his guns run empty is not a pilot who is fighting by the normal rules of aerial combat. He is a pilot who has decided that the outcome matters more than the method. And that kind of pilot in the cockpit of an aircraft above you is a different category of problem. The story of Mitralexis spread. It was the kind of story that defined what Greek pilots were, not just to the Italians, but to the Greeks themselves. A benchmark, a standard, an answer to the question of how far you were willing to go. The Italian Air Force, processing this story through its intelligence channels, filed it away under a category that would become increasingly relevant over the next 2 years. Things the Greeks will do that we did not expect. The file kept growing. The Greek pilots fought through the Italian campaign and then through the German invasion of April 1941. They flew against the Luftwaffe over Greece and then over Crete during the German paratroop assault in May 1941. The battle that cost Germany more casualties than any single operation to that point. And when Crete fell, the surviving Greek pilots made the final leg of the journey south, to Egypt, to Alexandria and Cairo, and the RAF bases along the Nile Delta, where British officers who had been watching the Greek campaign with admiration were now looking at a group of exhausted, angry, highly skilled pilots who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose except the war itself. The RAF knew exactly what it had. 335 Squadron was formed on October 10, 1941, at Achaia, in Palestine. Greek pilots, RAF structure, British aircraft, Hurricane fighters, heavier, more powerful, more capable of absorbing damage than anything they had flown over Greece. And over the Western Desert, eventually, Italian aircraft in their sights again. Late 1941, the Western Desert. 335 Squadron is operational. The pilots who form its initial roster are men who have already been to war, who have already fought Italy over their own country, who have already watched their airfields burn under Luftwaffe attack and their country fall despite everything they could do to prevent it. They know what they are flying toward. Italy, the Regia Aeronautica, operating over North Africa, is not the same force that stumbled into Greece in October 1940. It has been fighting in the desert for over a year. Its pilots have accumulated experience in this specific environment. They know the winds, the dust, the particular quality of desert light that makes aircraft identification difficult at certain angles and times of day. They are a competent, experienced force. But they are about to meet something they have encountered before. And this time, the Greeks are in better aircraft. The first significant engagements between 335 Squadron and Italian aircraft over North Africa produce after-action reports on the Italian side that contain a detail the pilots filing them find difficult to articulate precisely. The RAF squadron they are fighting is not behaving the way RAF squadrons typically behave. Italian pilots who have fought the British in North Africa know the standard RAF style: patient, disciplined, tactically orthodox, willing to wait for the favorable position before committing fully to an attack. These pilots are not waiting. They are coming hard and fast, and with a personal intensity that veteran Italian aviators identify immediately as something outside the normal parameters of what they have been fighting. There is a refusal to disengage when disengagement would be tactically prudent, a willingness to press attacks past the point where most pilots break off, a quality in the fighting that the most experienced Italian pilots, men who have been in the air over North Africa long enough to develop a feel for different national styles, cannot immediately categorize. They know it is different. They do not yet know why. The intelligence comes together gradually. Multiple engagements, multiple reports, the accumulating picture of a squadron that fights with a motivation that exceeds what the equipment or the tactical situation alone can explain. And then someone in Italian air intelligence puts the pieces together. The squadron they keep encountering, the one that fights like it, has a personal grievance rather than a military objective, is Greek. The pilots in those hurricanes are the men who flew against the Regia Aeronautica over Epirus and Albania, who fought Italy for 5 months in the Greek mountains, whose country was occupied by forces that included the Italian military, who escaped to Egypt with nothing and got back into cockpits and flew south looking for the same enemy in a different sky. When this intelligence reaches Italian pilots operating in the sector, the reaction is documented in the after-action records of the period. It is not the reaction of men who are surprised that Greeks can fight. They already know Greeks can fight. They learned that in Albania, in the snow, being pushed back 40 miles into their own territory by an army that wasn't supposed to be able to do it. It is the reaction of men who understand what it means to be the specific target of specific enemies. Not RAF pilots completing a mission, Greek pilots settling an account. There is a difference between fighting an opponent and fighting an opponent who is fighting you back for something specific. Every experienced combat pilot understands this distinction instinctively. The mathematics of aerial combat, altitude, speed, angle, ammunition, these remain constant, regardless of motivation. But motivation determines how long a pilot keeps coming after the mathematics suggest he should stop, and Greek pilots in 335 Squadron keep coming. An Italian squadron commander files an assessment of the air situation over the Western Desert in late 1942 that his superiors in Rome find uncomfortable to read. He writes that his pilots are reporting a qualitative difference in the opposition from this particular RAF unit, that they fight with a persistence that exceeds what Italian pilots typically encounter. That engagement after engagement, when the tactical situation suggests the attacking pilots should disengage, they do not disengage. He writes, "Intelligence confirms these are Greek pilots. If this is true, It explains everything we have been observing. They are not fighting for a strategy or an objective. They are fighting for something we took from them. That is a different kind of opponent entirely. That is a different kind of opponent entirely. An Italian Air Force commander, writing in the same document that contains his tactical assessment of fuel supplies and aircraft serviceability, acknowledging that the Greeks, the Regia Aeronautica, had failed to defeat on the ground in Albania, were now hunting them in the sky over Libya. The word that appears in Italian pilot accounts from this period, in the private letters, in the informal debriefs, in the conversations that veterans describe in post-war interviews, is not a tactical term. It is an emotional one. Terror, terror, not the abstract terror of facing a powerful enemy. The specific terror of facing an enemy who knows who you are and has reasons that go beyond military duty. The Greek pilots of 335 Squadron are not anonymous opponents. They are men from specific villages, specific families, specific airfields that Italian bombs struck in 1940. They watched specific colleagues die. They flew over specific Greek towns before those towns were occupied by Italian forces. Every Italian aircraft in their sights represents something concrete. And the Italian pilots who figure out what they are dealing with, who understand that the squadron hunting them over North Africa is staffed by men with personal grievances, measured in occupied cities and dead friends, carry that knowledge into every subsequent engagement. It changes how they fight, not in the sense of fighting worse, in the sense of fighting with an awareness that the opponent across from them is not a professional completing a task. He is Marinos Mitralexis, or someone exactly like him, someone who rammed an Italian aircraft with his propeller when his ammunition ran out, someone who will keep coming past the point where any rational calculation of self-preservation says to stop. That knowledge, in the cockpit of an aircraft at 15,000 feet over the western desert, with a hurricane closing from your 6 o'clock, is not a comfortable thing to carry. 336 Squadron was formed on February 25, 1943, over a year after 335, as the North African campaign was entering its final phase. By the time 336 became operational, the tide of the Desert War had already turned decisively at El Alamein. German and Italian forces were retreating westward under sustained Allied pressure. The Greek squadrons were flying offensive operations now, hitting retreating Axis columns, escorting bombers over Tunisian targets, doing the unglamorous work of an air force that has established superiority and is pressing it. 2 Greek squadrons in the North African sky. Italy had invaded Greece with overwhelming confidence in October 1940. By early 1943, Italian pilots in the Western Desert were filing reports about the Greek RAF units, hunting them, and using a word that no one in Rome wanted to read in an after-action document. Terrified. The file marked things the Greeks will do that we did not expect had become very thick indeed. You are watching this right now, because most people watching World War II content on YouTube have never heard of 335 Squadron. They have never heard that the pilots who escaped the fall of Greece got into British aircraft in Egypt and found the same Italian Air Force waiting for them over the desert. They have never heard the word that Italian pilots used when they realized who they were fighting. If that story deserves to be told, and it does, subscribe and hit the like button. This channel exists to find exactly these stories. The campaign continues through 1943 as the Axis position in North Africa collapses entirely. The Greek squadrons move with the front, from Egypt into Libya, toward Tunisia, over supply lines and ports and retreating columns. And then, when the North African campaign ends with the Axis surrender in May 1943, the war moves north, to Italy itself. Greek pilots flying over Italian territory, over the cities and airfields and infrastructure of the country that invaded their homeland. The specific geographic irony of it, Greeks in RAF aircraft above Italy, is not something that the official histories dwell on. But the Greek pilots knew where they were. The terror that Italian pilots documented in their after-action reports is not simply an emotional response. It has tactical consequences that compound through the North African campaign. Pilots who are fighting an opponent they know has personal motivation fight differently, not necessarily worse in technical terms, but differently in the decisions they make at the margins, the engagement they choose to avoid, the attack they break off earlier than they otherwise might, the sector they approach with more caution than the tactical situation strictly requires. Every such decision, multiplied across dozens of Italian pilots in the sector facing 335 Squadron, adds up to something measurable in the aggregate. Allied bombers that reach their targets because the fighter escort they carry fights with unusual persistence. Supply runs that get through because the interception is less aggressive than it might have been. Reconnaissance missions completed because the opposition in this particular sector has learned, through painful experience, that the Greek RAF unit does not disengage when pressed. The Greek squadrons are also part of the larger argument that the Greek government in exile, operating from Cairo, is making to the Allied powers throughout the war. Greece is under Axis occupation. The Greek state effectively ceased to exist in April 1941. What gives the Greek government in exile the standing to speak for Greece, to claim a place at the post-war table, to argue for Greek interests in the settlements that will eventually remake Europe, is the continued military contribution of Greek forces, on the ground, in the sea, and in the air. 335 Squadron flying escort over the Western Desert is not just a military operation. It is a political argument. It says, Greece is still fighting. Greece has not accepted the occupation. Greece will be at the table when this war ends. The Italian pilots who filed reports using the word terrified, who documented their recognition of what they were facing when they identified the Greek RAF units, inadvertently contributed to that argument. Their fear was confirmation. Confirmation that the Greeks they had failed to defeat in Albania were still fighting, still effective, still a force that professional military aviators took seriously enough to be afraid of. That confirmation, recorded in Italian after-action documents, is part of the record that establishes what Greece contributed to the Allied war effort. And when Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin make their calculations about the post-war order, the military record of Greek forces in exile is part of what they consider. The Greek pilots over North Africa are not just fighting Italy. They are fighting for their country's place at the table when the fighting stops. 335 and 336 squadrons flew through the North African campaign, through the Italian campaign, and into the final stages of the war in Europe. The pilots who survived came home to a Greece that had been devastated by occupation and then immediately torn apart by civil war. The country they had been fighting for from Egypt was not the country they returned to. The transition from fighting an external enemy with clarity of purpose to navigating the complexity of a Greek political situation that descended into civil war almost immediately after liberation was not one that their RAF training had prepared them for. Some adjusted, some did not. All of them carried what they had done. Marinos Mitralexis, the pilot who rammed an Italian bomber with his propeller on November 2, 1940, and landed and captured the crew, who escaped to Egypt and flew over North Africa in RAF Hurricanes, who hunted the same Regia Aeronautica that had invaded his country across 2 continents, survived the war. He kept flying. In 1948, 3 years after the war ended, Marinos Mitralexis was on a routine training flight. His aircraft, an Airspeed Oxford, crashed into the Aegean Sea. He died in a cockpit, over Greek waters. The man who had rammed an Italian bomber when his guns ran empty, who had flown south to Egypt when his country fell, rather than stop fighting, who had found Italy again over the western desert and pressed his attacks past the point where any rational calculation said to stop. He died doing what he had always done, flying. The Italian pilots who filed those after-action reports from North Africa, who wrote the word terrified in documents that their superiors in Rome found uncomfortable to read, were recording something real. They had recognized in the fighting quality of the Greek RAF units they were encountering the specific quality that makes an opponent different from all other opponents. Not superior equipment, not numerical advantage, not tactical genius. The knowledge of what they were fighting for. Greek pilots over North Africa were fighting for occupied cities and dead colleagues and families living under Axis administration, and the specific memory of what it felt like to watch their country fall while they were powerless to stop it from the cockpit of an aircraft that was running out of ammunition. That knowledge, in the hands of pilots skilled enough to use it, produced something that Italian after-action reports could only describe with one word: terror. 300,000 to 450,000 Greeks died in the Great Famine of 1941 to 1942, the hunger that Axis occupation created by stripping Greece of its food supplies. The Greek pilots over North Africa knew this. The numbers reached them even in Egypt, even in the RAF briefing rooms and the desert airstrips. They flew anyway, because flying was the only thing available to them. And when Italian aircraft appeared in their sights over Libya and Tunisia and eventually over Italy itself, when the specific markings of the Regia Aeronautica that had bombed their airfields in 1940 appeared at the end of their gun sights in 1942 and 1943, they pressed the trigger with everything that knowledge put behind it. Italy thought Greece was finished in April 1941. 335 Squadron was operational by October. Italy lost to Greece on the ground in the Albanian mountains in 5 months of fighting that cost Mussolini 3 generals and his military reputation. Then they met Greeks again over Africa, and the result was the same. If this story is still in your head right now, if you're still thinking about it, that like button is the right response. Hit it. This channel is built on the belief that the stories nobody tells are often the most important ones. If you share that belief, subscribe. We'll keep finding them. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country below. And if this story connects to your family's history, any family, any country, tell us. These moments belong to everyone. Thank you for carrying the weight of the Greek pilots forward. They kept flying when their country had fallen. Marinos Mitralexis kept flying until the Aegean took him. The least we can do is remember where they went.